Far above the crowded towns and dusty roads, where the mountains touched the clouds, Elias Harper lived a life few people understood. His cabin stood alone, in a hidden valley, surrounded by towering pine forests and steep cliffs. The nearest town was nearly a day's ride away. Most winters, heavy snow buried the trails so deeply that no visitor could reach him for months. That was exactly how Elias preferred it. Every morning before sunrise, he followed the same routine. He checked his traps, fed his horses, repaired fences, and gathered firewood. The silence of the mountains had become his closest companion. Years earlier, Elias had been a different man. He had owned a thriving ranch in the valley below. He had friends, neighbors, and dreams for the future. But a series of tragedies had taken everything from him. After losing the people he loved most, he abandoned the ranch and disappeared into the mountains. The townsfolk eventually stopped looking for him. Some believed he had become bitter. Others believed he wanted to forget the world entirely. The truth was that Elias simply no longer trusted happiness. Every time he had cared about something, life had taken it away. So he built walls around his heart stronger than the mountains surrounding him. One windy afternoon, while repairing the roof of a horse shelter, Elias noticed movement on the distant trail leading into his valley. Visitors were rare. Visitors arriving on foot were even rarer. He climbed down from the ladder and narrowed his eyes. A woman and a young boy were slowly making their way toward the cabin. Both looked exhausted. Their clothes were dusty from travel, and their pace suggested they had been walking for many hours. Elias immediately felt uneasy. Strangers usually meant trouble. As they approached, he noticed the woman was doing her best to appear strong, despite obvious fatigue. The boy beside her carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When they finally reached the cabin, the woman stopped and removed her hat. "Harper?" she asked politely. Elias nodded, but didn't invite them closer. "My name is Mary Carter." She gently rested a hand on the shoulder of the young boy. "This is my son, Tommy." The boy offered a nervous smile. Elias remained silent. Mary took a deep breath. "I've come looking for work." The mountain man crossed his arms. "What kind of work?" "Any kind." She glanced at the cabin. "I can cook, clean, sew, keep records, tend animals, whatever needs doing." Elias shook his head. "I don't need help." Mary's face fell slightly, but she refused to give up. "Please hear me out." Something in her voice made Elias pause. "My husband worked on the railroad project near Red Creek." Elias recognized the place immediately. A dangerous construction site known for accidents. There was a collapse 3 months ago. Mary looked toward Tommy. He never came home. The boy stared quietly at the ground. Elias felt an uncomfortable heaviness settle over the conversation. Mary continued, "After he died, I tried everything. I washed clothes, cleaned houses, took sewing jobs." She swallowed hard. "But winter is coming, and there isn't enough work." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Then, Elias delivered the answer he always gave. "No." Mary closed her eyes briefly. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment mixed with familiarity, as if she had expected rejection. "I understand," she said softly. She thanked him, despite everything. Then she and Tommy turned to leave. Elias watched them walk away. Something about the scene bothered him, not because they were leaving, because they had nowhere else to go. Still, he told himself it wasn't his problem. He returned to repairing the shelter. A few minutes later, however, a loud crash echoed from the lower pasture. Elias immediately dropped his tools. One of his horses had become trapped after a section of old fencing collapsed near a rocky slope. The frightened animal was struggling dangerously close to the edge. Elias rushed downhill. Before he could reach the horse, he saw someone else already there. Tommy. The boy had heard the commotion. Instead of running away, he had approached the frightened horse carefully. He spoke in a calm voice while keeping a safe distance. The horse gradually stopped panicking. That gave Elias enough time to secure a rope and pull the animal away from danger. Once the horse was safe, Elias looked at Tommy. That was foolish. Tommy lowered his head. I didn't want him to get hurt. Elias studied the boy. Most children would have been terrified. Yet Tommy had thought only about helping. Mary soon arrived, horrified to discover where her son had gone. She immediately apologized. He should have stayed with me. Elias looked at the rescued horse. The animal represented years of breeding and training. Without Tommy's help, it might have been lost. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Elias sighed. "You still looking for work?" he asked. Mary blinked. "What?" she said. "I asked if you're still looking for work." Hope immediately appeared in her eyes. "Yes," she said. Elias nodded toward a small guest cabin near the barn. "You can stay there." Mary stared in disbelief. "Really?" she said. "Winter's coming. I'll need help preparing supplies." The relief on her face was impossible to miss. For the first time since arriving, she smiled. A genuine smile. Tommy grinned as well. That evening, Mary and Tommy settled into the small cabin, while Elias sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. He wasn't sure why he had changed his mind. Maybe it was Tommy's courage. Maybe it was Mary's determination. Or maybe the loneliness he had carried for so many years was finally beginning to crack. What Elias didn't know was that this simple act of kindness would soon uncover secrets from his past and set all three of their lives on a path none of them could have imagined. Winter arrived early that year. By the middle of November, thick blankets of snow covered the mountain valley where Elias Harper lived. The trees stood silent beneath layers of white frost, and icy winds swept through the narrow passes connecting the valley to the outside world. For most people, the season would have felt lonely. For Elias, it was simply another winter. At least, that was what he expected. But this winter was different. For the first time in many years, he wasn't alone. Mary and Tommy had now been living on the mountain for nearly 6 weeks. What had started as a temporary arrangement was slowly becoming something neither side had anticipated. Every morning before sunrise, Mary helped prepare breakfast, while Tommy eagerly completed his chores around the ranch. The little guest cabin where they stayed had become warmer and more welcoming under Mary's care. She repaired torn curtains, organized supplies, and somehow managed to make even the rough mountain shelter feel like a home. Elias found himself noticing the changes, and strangely enough, he didn't mind them. One snowy morning, Tommy followed Elias into the barn. "Can you teach me how to braid rope today?" the boy asked. Elias chuckled. "You ask more questions than a newspaper reporter." Tommy grinned. "Is that a yes?" Elias shook his head. "Finish feeding the horses first." The boy rushed off. Watching him go, Elias felt something unfamiliar. For years he had avoided forming attachments. Now he found himself looking forward to the boy's endless curiosity. It reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. The thought brought both comfort and pain. To distract himself, Elias threw his energy into work. Several old structures on the property needed repairs before heavier snowstorms arrived. One of those buildings was an abandoned smokehouse that had stood untouched for decades. The small structure had belonged to Elias's father. After his father's death, Elias had never found a reason to use it. The building slowly deteriorated with time. One afternoon, Mary volunteered to help repair it. Together they spent hours replacing damaged boards and reinforcing the foundation. As they worked, Mary noticed something unusual. Near the back corner of the smokehouse floor, several wooden planks looked newer than the surrounding boards. The difference was subtle. Most people would never have noticed, but Mary had spent years helping her late husband repair homes. She knelt and examined the area more closely. "That's strange," she murmured. Elias looked over. "What is?" She tapped the wood. "These boards were replaced at some point." Elias shrugged. My father built this place before I was born. Mary continued studying the floor. A few moments later, she discovered a small metal ring hidden beneath years of dust. What's this? Curious now, Elias joined her. Together they pulled upward. To their surprise, a concealed wooden panel lifted from the floor. Beneath it was a narrow compartment. Inside rested a weathered metal box. Neither spoke for several seconds. The box appeared extremely old. Elias carefully lifted it out. Dust coated its surface. The lock had long since rusted away. He opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of yellowed papers, folded maps, journals, and sealed envelopes. For a moment, Elias simply stared. The handwriting on several documents was instantly recognizable. His father's. A strange feeling settled over him. It was as if a voice from the past had suddenly reached across the years. That evening they carried the box into the cabin. After dinner, the three of them gathered around the fireplace. Snow fell heavily outside, while Elias began examining the contents. The first items were journals. Page after page detailed his father's work, business dealings, and plans for the family's future. Some entries described land surveys, others recorded meetings with local investors. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Mary noticed a pattern. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the journals. The same three businessmen, men who had once been influential in the nearby valley. "Do you know them?" she asked. Elias frowned. "I remember hearing their names when I was young." Mary handed him one of the journals. "Your father didn't trust them." Elias read the passage carefully. His father's words were unmistakably cautious. Several entries mentioned concerns about dishonest contracts and missing records. As the evening continued, the mystery deepened. More documents emerged. Old property maps, financial records, survey reports, legal correspondence. Hours passed. Then, Mary unfolded a large map. The moment it opened, both she and Elias froze. The map outlined thousands of acres of mountain land. Most surprising of all was the name written across the top: Harper Family Holdings. Elias stared in disbelief. "That's impossible." Mary looked at him. "What is? My family never owned that much land." The map suggested otherwise, and it wasn't the only document. As they continued searching, they found official deeds bearing government seals. There were tax records showing decades of ownership. There were signed agreements and survey documents. The evidence pointed toward one startling conclusion. Long before Elias had retreated into the mountains, his family had owned an enormous section of the valley below. Land that now belonged to other people. Tommy listened quietly. "How can land just disappear?" he asked. Elias didn't have an answer. Mary, however, continued examining the paperwork. The more she studied it, the more concerned she became. Something wasn't right. Many documents ended abruptly. Several years of records appeared to be missing. Then she discovered a sealed envelope hidden between two journals. The letter inside had never been opened. It was addressed to Elias. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The letter had been written by his father shortly before his death. The words immediately caught his attention. "If you are reading this, then I fear my suspicions were correct." Elias continued silently. His father's letter described a growing conflict with several business partners. He believed they were attempting to seize control of valuable family property through fraudulent legal claims. Most importantly, he had gathered evidence proving ownership. The final paragraph left Elias speechless. "Should anything happen to me, the proof remains hidden with these records. Trust the documents. The land belongs to our family." Silence filled the room. Even Tommy sensed the importance of the discovery. Elias lowered the letter slowly. For years he had believed his family lost everything through bad luck and circumstance. Now another possibility emerged. What if they had been robbed? What if the life his father worked to build had been stolen? Mary carefully organized the documents. There may be enough here to prove what happened. Elias stared into the fireplace. His mind raced. The discovery raised questions he had never considered. Questions buried for decades. Questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. For years he had hidden from the world. Fighting for the truth would mean returning to it. It would mean confronting powerful people. It would mean reopening wounds he had spent half a lifetime trying to forget. The easier choice would be to put the box away, to pretend none of it existed. But as he looked at Tommy and Mary sitting beside the fire, something inside him shifted. For the first time in many years, he had people depending on him. People who believed in him. Perhaps the past could no longer remain buried. Outside, the snowstorm intensified. Inside, a hidden legacy had finally been uncovered, and none of them yet realized that the secrets inside that old metal box would soon draw them into a battle capable of changing all of their futures forever. By the time winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, everything in Elias Harper's life had already started to change. What once felt like an isolated world of silence and survival now carried a sense of purpose and danger. The discovery of his father's hidden documents had broken something open inside him. For years, Elias had believed his past was simply tragedy and loss. But now, Mary's careful reading of the records suggested something far more disturbing. His family hadn't just been unlucky, they may have been cheated out of everything. And if that was true, someone had to answer for it. The problem was simple. The men involved were not ordinary citizens. They were powerful landowners in the valley below, men with influence over local officials, courts, and trade routes. People listened when they spoke. People looked away when they acted. Elias, by contrast, was a man the world had already forgotten. That didn't make him weak, but it did make him alone. Mary could see the war building inside him. One evening, as they sorted through the remaining documents, she spoke gently. "You don't have to do this," she said. Elias didn't look up. "If I don't, nothing changes." Mary hesitated. It might be dangerous. Tommy, sitting nearby carving a piece of wood, looked up. "But it's their land, right? Grandpa Elias should get it back." The word grandpa made Elias pause for a fraction of a second, though he didn't correct the boy. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "It's not just about land," he said. "It's about proving what was taken." A long silence followed. Finally, he made his decision. They would go to the valley. The journey down the mountain was the first time in years Elias had left his territory. The further they descended, the more the world seemed to expand around them. Roads, buildings, smoke from chimneys, voices in the distance. Mary kept close to Tommy, while Elias walked slightly ahead, as if bracing himself against memories waiting below. When they reached the town of Red Creek, attention followed them immediately. People recognized Elias, or at least they thought they did. Whispers spread quickly. "That's Harper. He still lives up there? I thought he disappeared years ago." Some looked curious, others looked uneasy. But Elias didn't stop walking. They entered the small courthouse at the edge of town. Inside, the air felt colder than the mountain wind. Mary carried the documents carefully in a worn leather satchel. Elias stood before the clerk and formally requested a review of historical land ownership tied to the Harper family estate. At first, the clerk seemed uninterested. Old claims were common. Most went nowhere. But when Mary placed the first set of documents on the counter, the atmosphere changed. Deeds, maps, government seals. The clerk's expression tightened slightly. A preliminary hearing was scheduled. News traveled fast. Too fast. By the next morning, the men named in the documents had already arrived in town. They did not come alone. Two of them, Richard Hale and Morton Briggs, were longtime figures in the valley's mining and timber operations. Wealthy, confident, and used to controlling outcomes. They sat in a private room with town officials before the hearing even began. That morning, as Elias, Mary, and Tommy approached the courthouse, they were met by a different tone in the air. Hostility. Not open yet, but building. Inside the courtroom, the hearing began. At first, everything seemed procedural. Elias presented his claim. Mary organized the documents with calm precision, explaining their origin and timeline. Then the opposition spoke. Richard Hale stood slowly. He was calm, almost friendly in tone, but his words carried weight. "Mr. Harper has been absent from this community for many years," he said. "Now he returns with papers no one has seen in decades. Convenient timing, don't you think?" Murmurs spread through the room. Morton Briggs followed. "These so-called records could easily be fabricated," he added. "There is no way to verify their authenticity after all this time." Elias felt the familiar pressure of doubt forming around him. This was what power looked like. Not shouting, not violence, just control of belief. Mary stepped forward. Her voice was steady. "These documents include official seals, surveyor signatures, and registered landmarks," she said. "They match county archives. We've already submitted them for verification." For a moment, silence returned. Then the opposition shifted strategy. They attacked Elias himself. Rumors were brought into the courtroom. His isolation, his withdrawal from society, his lack of witnesses. The implication was clear. A man who lived alone in the mountains could not be trusted. Tommy suddenly stood. "He's not lying," the boy said firmly. Everyone turned. Tommy looked nervous, but he didn't sit down. "He saved a horse on our ranch, and he teaches me things, good things." A few people in the courtroom softened slightly. But the real shift came later. An elderly man from the valley unexpectedly stood up. "I remember Elias Harper's father," he said slowly. "Honest man. Built half this valley before those companies moved in." Another voice followed. Then another. Small memories, forgotten truths, old stories that had never been officially recorded but had never disappeared either. The room began to change, not suddenly, but steadily, like ice melting under sun. The officials called for a recess. Outside, Mary finally allowed herself to breathe. "It's working," she whispered. But Elias didn't look relieved, because he knew something they didn't yet fully understand. This wasn't over, not even close. By the end of the week, the documents had been verified as authentic by county archivists. Fraudulent transfers were uncovered in old filings. Names were traced. Signatures were compared. The conclusion became unavoidable. The Harper land had been taken illegally decades ago. When the final ruling came, it was delivered quietly, but its impact was enormous. The valley property was legally restored to Elias Harper. The courtroom did not erupt. There were no celebrations, just silence. Heavy, uncertain silence. Outside the courthouse, the opposition left without speaking. For the first time in years, Elias Harper had something the world had taken from him long ago: justice. But as he stood on the steps of the courthouse, with Mary and Tommy beside him, Elias realized something even more important. Winning the land was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of what came next. And whatever that future held, none of them could walk away from it now. Spring returned slowly to the mountains. At first, it came in small signs: melting snow along the ridges, fresh water rushing through frozen streams, and patches of green breaking through the white blanket that had covered the valley for months. But for Elias Harper, the biggest change wasn't in the land. It was in his life. The court's decision had returned ownership of the valley to him, but what it truly gave him was something far more complicated: responsibility. For years, the land had been controlled by others. Timber operations, grazing rights, and small settlements had all developed without him. Now, suddenly, everything legally belonged to a man who had spent most of his life alone in the mountains. Elias didn't celebrate. He simply stood on the edge of the ridge one morning, looking down at the valley stretching beneath him. "This all feels strange," he admitted quietly. Mary stood beside him. "Because it's real now," she replied. Behind them, Tommy was throwing stones into a melting stream, laughing every time the water splashed. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel empty watching a child laugh. He felt present. Instead of selling the land or pushing people out, Elias made a different choice, one that surprised nearly everyone in the valley. He opened parts of the property for fair use and employment. Old workers who had struggled under unfair ownership were given stable jobs again. Families who had lived in uncertainty were offered protection and stability. Small trade routes were restored, and timber operations were rebuilt with stricter fairness and safety rules. It wasn't about becoming rich. It was about rebuilding something that had been broken for decades. Mary became essential in this new chapter. Her ability to organize, manage records, and understand people made her the natural partner in running the growing operations. What began as temporary work in a mountain cabin slowly transformed into something much larger. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. Tommy, meanwhile, adapted quickly to the new environment. He moved easily between workers, animals, and the land itself. People in the valley began to recognize him as the mountain boy, the child who had once helped uncover the truth that changed everything. But to Elias, Tommy became something more personal. A reminder, not of what he had lost, but of what he had been missing. One evening, after a long day of work, Elias found Tommy sitting on the porch carving a small wooden figure. "What are you making?" Elias asked. Tommy smiled. "You," he said simply. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Does it look like me?" Tommy laughed. "Not yet." That night, Elias stayed outside longer than usual. He wasn't used to noise, people, or responsibility. But slowly, something unfamiliar was taking root inside him. Belonging. Weeks passed. The valley began to change under their care. Not just economically, but emotionally. People who had once been divided by fear and control began working together again. Markets reopened. Families returned. The sense of tension that had lingered for years slowly began to fade. Through it all, Mary remained steady. She never tried to take control of Elias's decisions, but she always guided them when needed. Her presence was calm, thoughtful, and grounding. One afternoon, while reviewing ledgers in the rebuilt office cabin, Elias paused. "You've done more for this place than anyone I know," he said. Mary looked up. "I didn't do it alone." Elias nodded slightly. "That's not what I mean." A quiet understanding passed between them. Neither of them spoke about what had grown between the lines of survival and trust. It wasn't something either of them had planned. It had simply formed, slowly, like roots beneath soil. As for Tommy, he had already decided something for himself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, he stood between Elias and Mary. "I don't want to leave," he said suddenly. Mary blinked. "You won't have to," Elias replied before she could answer. Tommy looked at him carefully. "Does that mean you're family now?" The question hung in the air. Elias didn't respond immediately. For most of his life, family had meant loss. Silence after laughter. But looking at Mary and Tommy standing there, something in him shifted. Not dramatically, quietly. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said. Tommy smiled instantly and ran to him. Mary didn't move at first. She simply watched, her eyes filled with emotion she had carried for too long, without relief. Later that evening, the three of them stood together on the porch of the cabin where it all began. The valley below was alive again. Lights, voices, movement, life. Elias looked out across it all. He had come to the mountains to escape the world, but somehow the world had followed him anyway. Not in the form of chaos, but in the form of a widow who refused to give up, and a boy who shared his last piece of bread with a stranger in need. "I used to think I lost everything up here," Elias said quietly. Mary glanced at him. "And now?" He looked at Tommy, then at her. "Now I think I was just waiting for something I didn't know I needed." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time in many years, Elias Harper didn't feel alone in it.